Hello everyone, it's Mr. Boff here. I've got another poem for you today that we're going to be looking at. The poem Afternoons by Philip Larkin, which feels particularly appropriate given I'm looking out my window and it's the beginning of July and it's raining, and that feels kind of appropriate given this the mood of this poem. And what a moody piece this poem is. A poem about the loss of youth, the tedium and repetition of adult life, and essentially a poem pervaded, as far as I can tell, by this overwhelming feeling of what we might call ennui at the quotidian tedium and repetition of adult life. And we've got some words there that I think are going to be very important to this poem. Ennui. If you look up the word ennui, sometimes it'll give a definition that just includes the word boredom. It's more than that. In fact, it's probably quite a word that's quite applicable to the lockdown experience. It's something like a combination of listlessness and dissatisfaction at the experience of life itself, feeling listless and dissatisfied and kind of bored. And another very useful word, which I both like and I think is very appropriate in this poem, is the word quotidian. Something like mundane and everyday. So if we're talking about quotidian existence, we're talking about how kind of tediously repetitive life can be, and of course that's very appropriate for lockdown too. So two useful words there to apply to this poem. Let's have a read of it, and then we can think a little bit more deeply about the language, the way this poem is organised. It has some interesting structural features, and it, as I say, how it establishes and produces through specific structural and language features that feeling of ennui, that feeling of sort of dissatisfaction and general sadness that's so typical of much of Philip Larkin's poetry. So this is Afternoons. Summer is fading. The leaves fall in ones and twos from trees bordering the new recreation ground. In the hollows of afternoons, young mothers assemble at swing and sandpit, setting free their children. Behind them, at intervals, stand husbands in skilled trades, an estate full of washing, and the albums lettered "Our Wedding" lying near the television. Before them, the wind is ruining their courting places, that are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school, and their children, so intent on finding more unripe acorns, expect to be taken home. Their beauty has thickened. Something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. A quite famous poem by Mr. Larkin. This was written in 1959, and if you can actually see that at the top, let me just move that. There we go. This was written in 1959, a period of time where many of the sort of labour-saving devices that we associate with a sort of functioning home, like washing machines and so on, weren't in sort of general use, weren't generally accessible to everyone. That was beginning to change, but obviously working at home was an enormous amount of work, and that was, following the Industrial Revolution, that domestic labour, the working at home, was, child rearing and so on, was considered the domain of women. Okay. And this is really a poem kind of about that, about domestic labour, the tedium of child rearing, the way in which you are sort of living for others in that experience. But it's, like, again, quite a lot of Philip Larkin's poetry from the point of view of an outsider looking in. There isn't necessarily a sense of solidarity with those people who are assembling at swing and sandpit. It's someone watching and observing and cataloguing this from afar. Okay, so really interesting poem. Let's work through it. Obviously, have a couple of reads through yourself. You can pause a video and do that. That's not a problem. We've got this interesting title, Afternoons. This is a poem, as I said previously, that is simultaneously very, very kind of specific to a particular moment in British history specifically, but also seems to be suggesting something more general, dare I say, even universal. Look at the title. It isn't, for example, The Afternoon. It isn't specific. It's Afternoons. So is this a sort of general comment on life itself? Quite possibly. Who knows? Okay. That's certainly one reading of the title, and I would say that's a reading that would survive the first line too. Summer is fading. We've got this kind of general declarative. Summer is fading, and very clearly, there's a reading of that would see that as metaphorical. This is a poem about the passing of time and the loss of youth and everything that entails. So summer is fading, and we think about, we tend to think of our life, human life, in terms of seasons. Childhood might be spring, your kind of our adolescence and 20s possibly would be something like the summer, and then autumn and winter are as you're growing older. There's a sense of that going on here. Summer is fading. This loss of youth and all of the optimism and excitement and warmth of summer is fading away, and shifting into something more autumnal and therefore slightly more unsettling. Summer is fading. The leaves fall in ones and twos. Nice monosyllabic line. Normally, I would say the use of the leaves fall in ones and twos, that series of monosyllables, indicating or conveying a sense of tedium, as well as obviously the actual line itself, the kind of meaning of the line, the leaves fall in ones and twos, linking back to this notion of things fading, of life drawing to a close. Okay, from trees bordering the new recreation ground. Okay, so it's very, very Larkin about some of these lines, as you might expect. So from trees bordering. So often nature's presented in poetry and I suppose in art more generally as kind of freedom. The natural world is a place with no borders or boundaries, and it's about kind of free expression. Not so here. Trees bordering. There's almost a sense of the trees becoming kind of prison-like, that they are surrounding the new recreation ground, penning the people in, rather than this kind of sort of free sense of natural abundance and escape from the human world and from human society. The trees actually here are kind of penning everything in. The new recreation ground. Again, you've got interesting sort of contrast between bordering and recreation. So they're at a playground, a newly constructed playground, which you would think there's a kind of grim irony in that the playground, which should be about freedom, is prison-like. So we've got that interesting, rather depressing irony there, that the new recreation ground, which should be promising kind of freedom and excitement and fun and play and joy, actually, and as the poem progresses, this becomes even more apparent. It feels somewhat prison-like and regimented. In the hollows of afternoons, that's fantastic kind of spatial metaphor, the hollows of afternoons. So look at this metaphorical language. It's extremely downbeat, and obviously it's about emptiness. This sort of sense of the afternoon being a void, the kind of consisting of nothing that needs to be filled. It's a really sort of bleak image, I suppose, of afternoons, that this is just sort of time to kill. What are we going to do with ourselves? In the hollows of afternoons, young mothers assemble. Again, we're looking at this notion of it being regimented, that people feeling that they're all having to assemble and turn up. That's what that word assemble is conveying, that sense of regimentation. Young mothers assemble at swing and sandpit. Again, the sibilant S sounds confirming that sense of regimentation at swing and sandpit. Setting free their children. Of course, the implication running in that final line of the first stanza, not the adults. So the children are still free. The parents are not. Which is again really one of the core ideas of this poem. Okay, so we've got this first stanza then. Interesting things going on. In terms of the rhyming, we've got afternoons and twos. We've got a sort of half rhyme going on there, but generally speaking, there isn't a kind of neat rhyme scheme at all. There isn't one to speak of, and therefore there's this general sense of slightly disjointed sense throughout certainly this first stanza, and it's a sense I would argue that continues throughout the poem. So bleak, kind of, we've got this almost sort of general comment, metaphorical comment on life and the loss of one's youth and the responsibility these young mothers have for their children, and feeling kind of regimented, possibly even imprisoned by parental responsibility. Let's see where the poem goes next. Behind them, at intervals. So again, behind them, not stood with them, behind them. So there's a kind of distant aspect to it. Behind them at intervals, again, intervals, this sense of regimentation. Stand husbands in skilled trades. So their lives are tedious and regimented. You know, the women are engaged in domestic labour, child rearing, looking after their kids. The husbands, okay, they're going out to work, and remember, we've got really 1959, got really kind of neat, clear sort of gendered demarcation in terms of work roles. Stand husbands in skilled trades, you know, their lives are tedious, their lives are regimented, and they're stood at intervals, and they're distant from their wives, okay, which is going to become even more upsetting when we read the next couple of lines. An estate full of washing. So this is, you know, domestic labour. Extremely demanding, you know, a huge amount of work, often ignored, and what is still, I would argue, in many ways, wrongly considered, you know, women's work. It's changing massively, but that idea probably still lingers. You know, this idea that of the women having an estate full of washing, their work is never done. The work of almost domestic servitude, domestic labour, an estate full of washing obviously accentuates just the extent of that domestic labour and the amount of work that it takes, particularly if they've not got access to, you know, what would have been in 1959 very newfangled inventions like washing machines. And the albums lettered Our Wedding. What's interesting here is so much going on in this couple of lines. And the albums lettered Our Wedding. So first off, it says albums. So these albums connecting to, you know, the estate full of washing. And the albums, the implication runs here that they all have the same lettering on these wedding albums, Our Wedding. So there's a sort of tedious kind of repetition, lack of creativity there, that everyone sort of has the same kind of album, and it's lettered Our Wedding. Lying, now a little bit of double entendre there. This is, I would say, purposefully ambiguous. Does it mean that the album is like lying on the lying, on a table near the television. But there's also a little bit of a play on words there, given that lying can also mean, deceiving. So is the notion of love and marriage a lie? I told you it wasn't a very cheerful poem. Okay, lying near the television. So it's almost been discarded. It's sort of lost its kind of romantic vigour, this object, and it's just stuck on the side now. Okay, what a grim kind of image that is. The wedding, the romantic love has kind of given way to, it's been neglected. Before them, the wind is ruining their courting places. Okay, so behind them, behind the women are stood the husbands, and before them, the wind is ruining their courting places. So they sort of seem little parallel structure going on here. They sort of seem surrounded by, on one side, their husbands, and on the other side, the wind. The wind is often used as a way of conveying the kind of ravages of time. The way time kind of wears things away. We talk about, the winds of change and so on. The wind is ruining their courting places. So these places courting places, like where they would have romantic rendezvous when they were young, the wind is damaging those, is ruining them, making them unpleasant. There are still courting places. This is such a fantastic stanza break here. Is ruining their courting places that are still courting places. So you've got this sort of strange dislocation. They don't go to those courting places anymore because their romantic days are gone. That are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school. Fantastic use of brackets there. But the lovers are all in school. Again, a sort of sense of separation. The lovers are in school. The lovers are young. Their time, these married women with their husbands, their time for sort of exciting courting and romance and so on, that's over. This is all happening somewhere else. Okay. Again, I told you, this is not a very cheerful poem. Okay, that are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school, and their children. So the children of the women and the husbands, and their children so intent on finding more unripe acorns. So there's the children are still kind of enthusiastic about potential. And what I mean by that is this unripe acorns that obviously eventually going to grow into an oak. So their children so intent on finding more unripe acorns. These unripe acorns are obviously sort of full of potential, just like the children. And the children have, so intent, have a kind of enthusiasm for life that seems to have completely faded away in the husbands and these young mothers. Finding more unripe acorns, expect to be taken home. So it's the demands of children. Larkin himself never had children, in fact, famously writes about his most famous poem is all about the damage parents do to their children, whether they know the damage what they're doing or not, and eventually says don't have children, which is rather interesting. So not the most sort of cheerful and positive expression of the pleasures of parenting here. Expect to be taken home. Look at that word expect. The sense of demand, the idea that these mothers aren't living their own life but are having to look after others and put their own desires and wishes and dreams to one side. Their beauty has thickened. Okay, Larkin is perfectly capable in his poetry of displaying some pretty clear moments of misogyny. I think we've got one here. Their beauty has thickened. So what do we mean by that? It's a very powerful line, but it's a really unpleasant line at the same time, that the women have lost their youth and their beauty. You know, it's thickened. I have this sort of image of hands growing kind of fat and calloused. Not a pleasant image. So their sort of youthful freshness has gone and is thickened. And obviously there's a sort of association there that, you know, they've had children and they put on weight, and it's this, you know, pretty unpleasant image. And, you know, a lot of people who read this might see this as a rather you know, misogynistic line, which I think would be perfectly defensible position. But it's powerful at the same time. Their beauty is sickened. You know, this sense of life kind of getting on top of them. And then, very famous final two lines, something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. Something, I think it's something rather than specifically saying what it is, because it's kind of multifaceted. There are many things doing this. Adult responsibility, routine, lost or thwarted dreams, children, society. Let's just move that down so you can see that. That they are, and it's very, very powerful metaphor, something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. They're no longer in control of their life, that their lives are being kind of driven forward by something else, that they are, you know, kind of taking a back seat in their own lives. What a grim and depressing statement that is. But that's kind of true. It's kind of true, you know, they're spending all their time dealing with this estate full of washing, of feeling duty-bound to go and assemble at Swingan Sandpit and look after their children, these children who are demanding and expecting so much of them. They're not seeing their husbands very regularly because the husbands are, you know, standing behind them. There's a sense of, you know, distance and dislocation. There is love and there is romance and there is excitement and joy going on, but it's somewhere else. And the people who are experiencing that are still in school, okay? Not for you, young mother, this time has gone, okay? That this horrible void and emptiness of the hollows of afternoons is resulting in this poem that, you know, I mean, this is a crucial word there, fading, right? The very, very first line, summer is fading. This idea of listlessness, of dissatisfaction, a poem that is, we might say, suffused or is permeated with this sense of ennui at, as we've said previously, the mundane, the quotidian repetition of life for these young mothers, particularly young mothers who will be living in the late 1950s. And you know, this will begin to change over time. It'll take a long time to change, and hasn't changed quickly enough for many people. We've got this kind of interesting poem then that's simultaneously suggesting that this is a sort of general human process of summer fading, you know, of love being for younger people, of aging, of having to raise children, and there's a sort of cycle that has always gone on, and yet it's also a poem that's very, very marked by the, you know, specificities of its time. It's a poem that you can tell was written in 1959 and is kind of marked by that. So lots going on here. You know, you'd be thinking about this poem possibly even in comparison with something like Ozymandias, you know, the sort of ravages of time. Very, very different in many ways, but also there are some similarities. Think about the depiction of the wind here ruining the courting places, for example. And as well, you know, you could be thinking about this as a love poem, as a particularly bleak and upsetting and depressing love poem, but perhaps it's, you know, a love poem nonetheless. But it's also a poem about place. You know, again, a depiction of nature and place that is nowhere near as free and as joyful as one might imagine. This is. I don't know. I'm thinking, you could compare this perhaps quite profitably to a poem like "To Autumn," the John Keats poem that's also in the anthology. So lots of ways of comparing this poem to other poems in the anthology. A wonderful poem in its own way, although it kind of leaves you feeling sort of emotionally drained by the time that you've finished thinking about it.